I'm Adam Boulton. My current title is Editor-at-Large at Sky News, and I present Sky News Tonight from 7 to 9, Mondays to Fridays.
And how did you get into television?
I was quite lucky in as much as after university, I went to university in England and America. I came back at one of the periods of expansion in television that in the early 80s, as well as BBC and ITV, there was the launch of Channel 4, and there was the launch for the first time ever of breakfast television. And I managed to get employed largely because at that stage, the mantra was, we want fresh young people with new thoughts. We don't want the old school of broadcasters. So I went to a company called TVAM, which was difficult to think of now. It was a front page story for about 3 years. A lot of famous people involved at the beginning, didn't hit its commercial targets. They all left or were sacked. And actually it was a very good place for a young person to climb quickly because the levels above you kept on getting cold.
And tell us a bit more about what it was like in those early days to be working on breakfast television.
Well, I think that the most striking thing about television then was it was heavily unionised, and so there was a lot of demarcation between jobs, National Union of Journalists operating as journalists, the ACTT operating with some producers and cameramen and soundmen, and then a different union doing lighting. And so an awful lot of trying to do television was based around trying to manage those very much competing sections. Breakfast television was great for me because it had never been done before. BBC could have done it at any point in its history, but only decided to compete when ITV got a franchise, a license to do it. And we pretty much invented it. We started out with a rather sort of high-minded mission to explain that had been jointly written by John Burt and Peter Jay, former ambassador to America, then known as the cleverest man in Britain. And I remember having discussions as to whether we should do a program, an item about what was then called female circumcision, now called the female genital mutilation, at 8 in the morning. We did do it. And at that early stage, there wasn't that much concentration on things like showbiz. And then what happened was because breakfast television, TVM in particular, was in bad commercial trouble, there was a switch where long-term professional television investors came in rather than funds looking for a quick return. They brought in a man called Greg Dyke initially from ITV. He identified the audience, which by and large was young mothers with children, and we then recast a program around that. But what was interesting was that the license, the franchise, depended on having a strong current affairs element. So we always struck with having our own news operation, and certainly what tended to happen was the first hour of the program was very heavily news dominated, and then throughout the hour towards 9:30 when it came off air, it became more lighter and magaziney. And really what you see as breakfast television, as daytime television in this country now, not just BBC Breakfast, but also the morning show on ITV that Philip Schofield does and elsewhere, that style of television had not really been done to any great extent on a national basis in the UK before, and that's what we pioneered.
And did the idea of 24-hour news come in at the same time?
No. The Channel 4 and breakfast television started at the beginning of the 80s. 24-hour news in this country came in at the end of the 80s, and it came in after the launch of CNN, about 6 or 7 years after CNN. And I think there are two reasons for that. The first, and their related reasons, was the practicalities of doing it. Very, very difficult to do rolling news with the then union arrangements and demarcations, and TVAM actually went into a major strike in 1986, 1985, 86, when the management kept the channel on air during a very bitter strike and effectively broke the ACT union in a similar way to which the Wapping dispute had broken the print unions. But the second reason why 24-hour television rolling news became possible was because of the technology, that it became possible and even cheaper to go live or show live pictures than to do the traditional thing of go out, shoot them, edit them, bring them back. I mean, I remember conversation ahead of the 1983 election when Greg Dyke was there and realised that to cover the election we needed to have a live capacity, and we bought a fifth-hand van, famously known as the ice cream van, which was our only live link vehicle, and Greg Dyke effectively had to write a personal guarantee for the $75,000 that cost, because at that stage the company was broke. Now, increasingly, we do everything pretty much live or not at all, and that process of editing and turning round finished reports is not something which happens in 24-hour news, so we needed the technology to catch up with us, really.
What's been the influence of 24-hour news?
Well, it's quite interesting in as much as I remember Sky News went on air and the BBC didn't in fact go on air for another 6 years after that. And I remember saying to a senior BBC executive, why does the BBC need to go into 24-hour news? You know, you have your flagship bulletins, 9 o'clock news, which became 10 o'clock news, 6 o'clock news. And he just said to me, he said, well, because the audiences, we've done all the research and the audiences for news bulletins are going to go down like that. Now, actually, that's turned out to be apocalyptic. There are, although audiences have dropped steadily, there are still millions of people who watch the news at 10 and the 10 o'clock news in a volume which is not typically what happens either here or in America for rolling news. My own view is that, as in the world of sport, 24-hour channels have simply given people much more access to information to make their own decisions. So I think there's been a shift from, if you like, a kind of authoritative ex cathedra, this is what's happening in the world today, to we know you're interested in what's happening in the world, we will give you the best information we can in as near to real time as we can so you can draw your own conclusions. So, for example, I don't think it's any accident that Sky News started and was actively involved in the discussions for the arrangements for televising the Houses of Parliament, for televising parliamentary committees. We've been involved in discussions about getting cameras into court, and they're now in the Court of Appeal. So it was that shift from, which interestingly I don't think the British audiences have still quite got their heads around, from we're going to tell you how it is to we're going to tell you to the best of our ability what's happening. I think they're, you know, and almost assembling the news on air through the hours. And I think frankly, the authority of traditional news bulletins was sometimes overestimated. I mean, when that was all we had, they were actually often wrong. And we've learned how to deal with information which is incomplete, has many sides to it, in a much more intelligent way.
What have been some of the most important breaking news stories you've covered?
Well, we were lucky right at the beginning because there were two very major stories. The first was the first Gulf War, and that began the embedding and the broadcasting live from the field with advancing forces. The other one was, for me, affected me more, was the fall of Margaret Thatcher. And really, that goes all the way through to the 2010 election and the formation of the coalition in the world of politics, and in more general news, certainly the various Middle East wars that have taken place. We've been able to cover, live firefights and really bring home to people what happens in war. We had big audiences for courtroom trials, Louise Woodward, OJ, Michael Jackson, the various Michael Jackson trials. And again, this is giving people the information to draw their own conclusions. And for us, 24-hour news, you've got breaking news, giving people the information as quickly as possible. But what you also have, very importantly, is analysis. You have to have the journalists who are confident enough and informed enough to analyse and tell people the implications of what's going on or the reasons for what's going on, and really to be prepared to do it off the top of their head. And if I've made any difference at all in journalism, it is that prior to Sky News, people used to treat British politics with kid gloves. It would be, such and such a minister said this, such and such a minister said that, often indirect reporting because we didn't have television pictures, and then a very, very cautious piece to camera summing it up. And I had been in America in the early 80s. I'd seen how they did in America, and I felt confident to, partly, I suppose, because we were a startup channel, we didn't have that bigger audience. I felt confident enough to go on television and to give people my analysis within impartiality as to what was happening. I always liken it to being a bit like a sports reporter. And although I don't want to overdo this, I think I set a style which was then picked up on, and so people like Andrew Marr and Nick Robinson did what they do after I started doing it. Let's just put it that way. I mean, I'm not saying Pat's analysis was better than mine. I'm not saying that, but I think we did make that change in political coverage, and I think that then affected the coverage of other matters. I mean, a major story for Sky, which I wasn't really involved in, was Madeleine McCann, but the depth which Martin Brunt, our crime reporter, and the team went into with that story right at the beginning certainly helped establish the McCanns and Madeleine McCann to the point that it became a story of national significance and importance as it should have been. I mean, similarly, when you get big changes in public mood, where, if you like, the news agenda and the public agenda, the public is engaged in that news agenda. I mean, in Sky's time, the death of Diana, for example, or the rise of New Labour, that is when it's most rewarding to be doing breaking news, because you not only have this front row seat bringing the story to people live, but sometimes you because you're paid to do it, you should be able to spot the currents and the significances sometimes before a general audience has realised.
Would you say, therefore, that Sky News has its own particular persona?
Yeah, I think all channels have a persona. I mean, people always talk about this question of bias in television. I think by and large the British channels, Channel 4 News perhaps the exception, but by and large the British channels behave honourably in terms of they don't have an agenda and they don't push an agenda. But I think the BBC is inevitably of the public sector and has a slight mentality, which is that the public sector is generally good and that the profit motive and business is suspicious. I think because we know that we're part of a commercial operation and part of a commercial business, are perhaps more sceptical about the public sector and public provision, more willing to question it, and also perhaps less negative towards business and the profit motive and all that. In the case of Sky News, there's no doubt about it, Sky News would not exist if it wasn't for the commitment of Rupert Murdoch and the personal commitment he has to news. He's never, in my experience, sought to influence the news or to tell us what to do or to tell us what editorial line. But there have been times when the company, particularly in the early days, was not doing well commercially, where a lot of business people were saying we need to get rid of the news channel, and he said the news channel is very important. But that does mean that because Rupert Murdoch does have an editorial voice elsewhere in his in the news businesses that he's concerned with, it does mean that to some in the public we're seen as just Murdoch news. I defy them to show any evidence that we do show that bias, and I think our coverage of the phone hacking scandal and the subsequent inquiries, Leveson inquiry, showed us to be pretty fearless as far as our editorial priorities go. But one does have to accept that people working at the Sun or the Times, they are our cousins, and even if they get themselves into trouble, one understands the motivation of what they're doing.
What was the target audience for Sky News in the early days?
I think the target audience was, basically when Sky started, we were offering vertically streamed channels, sports channels, entertainment channels, news channels. So what we were saying to people was, rather than sit at home and have a program controller assemble your viewing, you can have your own. You can make your own menu of what you watch when, and we also discovered that really the USP of all television these days, in an age of video cassettes and all that, is live. The live event. That you can't see a football match, or you can't see an election result, or you can't see a television debate between politicians any other way than watching it live. And so our job was to cover the agenda, but rather than work towards a bulletin, to be producing stuff of quality across a 24-hour cycle. I think we always accepted, and this is a crucial difference about 24-hour news and a crucial difference about what's happened within television, is that Tony Hall at the BBC, when he was in charge of their news, said rather plaintively, we can't force the public to eat their greens anymore, by which he meant that in the days when the BBC had a monopoly, or even in the duopoly with ITV, people would want to watch, take the 6 o'clock news. Neighbours was very popular for about a decade. And one of the tasks of the editor of the 6 o'clock news was to hold as much of the audience that he inherited, or she inherited from Neighbours, through the 6 o'clock news. And in fact, what happened is they lost about half their audience in the first 5 minutes. But we never had those pressures, because we always knew that people would only switch to a rolling news channel if they wanted rolling news. They weren't going, we weren't going to get accidental viewers who were waiting for Coronation Street or EastEnders to pop up. And so I think that did mean that right from the start, we weren't looking for a particular demographic, but we were assuming that our audience was interested in the news in a way that perhaps with a daytime audience, a breakfast television audience, an early evening audience, you can't necessarily make those assumptions.
Did you deliberately, and do you deliberately, target key influencers? I'm thinking of the fact that, for example, the audience for Sky News may still be relatively small, But everywhere you go, the banks, the institutions in the city, communications companies and so on, I find that Sky News is invariably the one they're watching.
Well, Sky News has never had a big marketing budget because it has been a shop window into the subscription, the pay TV model, and by and large has been, well, we can talk about it later, but I mean, had pretty much free to air, although a lot of people don't know that. So that talking about actively seeking out audiences is never really done because we've never really had a marketing director or whatever. The only kind of explicit efforts we've made in that area were to get people to carry the channel abroad, which has been an important revenue stream. But I took the decision, and you know, I was running the political department. I think I just got the job. I was just 29, and I took the view that, you know, we needed to be impactful in Westminster because media companies have influence perhaps above their weight in commercial terms because they matter to politicians. Politicians, you know, you want to be in a situation where politicians want to come on your channel to make their case. And, you know, in the early days, we did have some stand-up rows with some politicians or departments who said, well, what's the point of doing you? I can do BBC and ITV. And we had to literally physically fight sometimes to get our cameras into the room to do the interviews. So it was important for us that we could offer a competitive service and we could offer it ahead of the traditional news bulletins, and there was an element, certainly, I mean, things have slightly changed with the expansion of the internet, but there was still a strong element of agenda setting that, you know, the political parties and the politicians are fighting for the airtime through the day because they know that the television channels and opinion formers are watching the rolling news. So when it comes to the evening, the person who's set the tone during those exchanges during the day is likely to be the person who comes out best in the evening news bulletins.
To what extent has social media had an impact on Sky News?
Well, everyone will tell you that the impact of social media is that you get an immediate response from your audience, that it certainly can provide, you know, a new sources of information very, very quickly. I mean, you know, if we hear now that there's been, you know, a big explosion in York, possibly the first eyewitness reports, the first pictures will come in through social media, although one has to be extremely cautious because what we can do in professional news organisations is curate and aggregate and verify the information which is coming in, and there are well-established cases of people spoofing or trying to spoof the news media, not just Sky, through the use of social media. Social media also means that you can do things in different ways. For example, in the internet and Twitter now were very important in assembling panels of questions or indeed audiences for some of the political debates which we've done. And now I think we're moving through a phase where analysis of big data, analysis of social media is another part of the news analysis which you can offer. You know, how many people watch something, how people responded to what they were hearing on television in terms of a yes, no worm, you know, those type of things. So I see social media as an extra tool, And I also see social media as an additional forum where we can reach new audiences by having a presence in, whether it's Snapchat or on Twitter or on other platforms. I mean, half of the people who access the Sky News website now access it through mobile phones. So there are constant changes of interacting with audiences, and there's no doubt that our generation, my generation, grew up with the assumption that in every home there was a television in the corner, and that was one of the focuses of households. The generation growing up now, there are lots of screens around, but there isn't that same focus on the television and what the broadcasters are operating. So as a news organisation, we need to find as many ways as we can of connecting with that audience, while, in my view, and fortunately this is the view of Sky News, not losing the sight of the fact that the spine of our news operation is our television channel.
Can you describe the successful campaign that you ran for the televising of the leaders' debates in the last two general elections?
Yeah. I, over the years, with my different employers, have always felt that really it's the front to democracy that we haven't had big televised debates during general elections, because it seems to me that we know that television certainly has been and is still the biggest single source of information that the public have and the public use, and therefore I've frankly found it disgusting that politicians in this country have not been willing to debate, and have found various spurious, in my view, excuses for not debating. But when we discussed the matter sort of about 2 years before the 2010 election, the head of Sky News, John Riley, was actually more concerned about public engagement and lowering turnout and a lack of interest in politics, which had been manifested in a decline in audiences since 1989 for our coverage and everyone else's coverage of the elections. And the initial problem which John raised was how we could increase voter engagement in the political process, which we thought was a good thing. And after discussions, we came down to the view that the most important thing that television could do to get voter engagement was to get television debates. And John and I and the company started campaigning for them. Now, at that stage, really the whole question of TV debates was almost a matter of commercial competition. That the BBC, quite possibly looking after their own interests, took the view that it was not their role to campaign for television debates, that they took the formal view that to campaign for television debates would be an interference too far in the political process, and that they had to be extremely cautious about that. ITV, which going back then historically was not in a particularly happy state at the time, really had quite a dog in the manger attitude to the debates, which was that they didn't really want the debates because they weren't sure that they would get a decent audience in prime time. But if debates did happen, they felt that they should pretty much have an exclusive on holding at least one debate. And they weren't, frankly, particularly interested in actually having a collaborative approach to trying to bring debates about. Now, the big sort of stick, if you like, in trying to bring debates about seemed to us to be the threat of the empty chair. We had no intention of empty chairing anyone if we could avoid it, but if you got to the point that two of what was then seen to be the three main parties, two of the three main parties agreed to participate, the biggest threat was to say, okay, given the way in which electoral law has loosened up, we will stage a debate with Liberal Democrat and Conservative, and it's up to you whether you turn up or not. But to get there, you had to get to the point where you had at least a relationship with trust with two of the parties such that they were prepared to take part in a two-legged stool debate. And what happened was that we did secure from the Conservative Party the commitment that if it came to it, David Cameron would simply do a debate with the Liberal leader. We had an agreement from the Liberal leader, and that therefore meant that Sky credibly could say, okay, we will hold a television debate. It's up to the leaders whether they turn up. Now, Sky News was probably the only channel that could have done that, in as much as primetime airtime on the BBC or on ITV would never credibly be given over to a two-legged debate, firstly. And secondly, the political risk of being seen to campaign for that and being seen to put pressure on one of the parties, probably only Sky had the balls to do at that time. And when I say that, it's partly because were a more edgy news organisation. Some people would say we had less to lose or whatever. And what happened was, we were quite open with all the parties about what we were doing. And the other position which we took very early on was that we felt it was important that debate should happen. So any debate which we had, we declared right at the outset that we would not seek to make commercial gain by doing it exclusively. We would make it available to everybody. Again, you can make an argument to say, well, that only made sense because the audiences for rolling news compared to the audiences for terrestrial are disproportionate. I'll leave people to draw their own conclusions on that. So we said we'd make it available to everybody live as it happened. So in that sense, it wouldn't be a kind of overtly Sky News event. So as soon as Gordon Brown put out his statement saying he would take part in debates, which basically Sky had secured unilaterally, we said, okay, fine. What we're going to do is do this collaboratively with the other broadcasters. So at that point, Sky rolled our debate, if you like, which we had secured single-handedly, into negotiating with the BBC and ITV on one side and the three parties on the other side, with a kind of in-out involvement of Channel 4 which we didn't resist, because as you can see in the most recent election, we did a co-production with Channel 4. And so we, if you like, we got our foot in the door, but we then took the decision to work with the other broadcasters to achieve it, and duly we got three.
Thinking more broadly about British journalism, so print and TV, do you think that we should be worried about the fact that we missed the historic sex abuse scandal stretching back over 50 years?
No, because I interviewed Johnny Rotten yesterday, and we reminded each other how in 1978 he was banned from the BBC for saying that everyone knew Jimmy Savile was dodgy. I think there have been allegations against people. I actually see it the other way round, which is that I think a lot of the reaction to the undoubted abuses of Jimmy Savile, which only emerged after his death, and which I see are primarily a problem for the BBC, I have to say. That was the organisation which promoted Jimmy Savile and which protected him to a certain extent. And I think rather than focus on that, I think this has become a rather blunt instrument with a sort of slightly sensationalist press and media generalising the story with as yet no evidence. And I do think that sometimes the media gets involved in a kind of mood of hysteria and witch hunt, along with others, along with politicians and police and all that. And I think we are having a bit of that at the moment. I think it's important issue, but I think it needs to be needs to be treated with caution. And I think it's not our job to stop people doing it, but I think if you look at the man standing out, the police chief standing outside Ted Heath's house and making allegations like that, I mean, I think rightly one's analysis of that should include comment as this might perhaps be a rather outrageous thing to do.
And one last general question. Quite a lot of people say, well, in fact, a lot of people say, there are too many channels on television, but there's nothing to watch on TV. How do you respond to that?
I think it's a bit like a library now. It's like saying there's nothing to read. I mean, there is the world at your fingertips. You can download it, you can get it on your Kindle. There are still public libraries. I mean, there's an awful lot out there. I personally, I'm very radical about this. I personally think there is an awful lot of good quality out there. I don't think that the bulk of it is being produced by the BBC. And I think that the idea of having this publicly funded entity basically producing middle-brow, low-brow culture is not good for our society. And, I personally make myself incredibly unpopular. I think the things that I actually think are rubbish and would I'd never consider watching are the things that are most popular. They are things like Top Gear and Bake Off and Strictly Come Dancing and all that. And I, from my, elite, snooty, blah, blah, I just think all that stuff is rubbish. And I think if people want to watch it, it would doubtless have a commercial future. But I think saying that you look down the schedules and there's nothing that any sane person would want to watch on BBC One, BBC Two, ITV, and Channel 4, which has got some sort of body distortion program or something. I think in terrestrial television, there probably isn't anything to watch a lot of the time, but I think good quality visual and sound images available on screen, I think there's probably more than ever before. On
terrestrial television, tell me why you say there probably isn't anything to watch.
Well, because I think we've accepted, and we're accepting it now with the BBC's slogan of, for us all or there for everyone, or whatever it is, we're accepting this notion that mass audience is public service. And therefore, I do think, and it goes back to, I remember being at a Royal Television Society and News Awards, and they gave ITV an award for best news or something the same year that it was moving the News at 10 out of the News at 10 slot and cancelling World in Action. And I just thought, this is hypocrisy gone mad. You know, the view is mainstream terrestrial television wants to maximise its audience for as long as possible, and there has been a collective decision that the way to do that is to go from being middlebrow to lowbrow.
Hence,
You know, it used to be Morse, and now it's David Williams in, you know, some crappy adaptation of Enid Blyton or something, or Agatha Christie, which is more about style than substance.
and is this why we've seen the tremendous growth of factual entertainment?
Well, I think one of the reasons for the growth of factual entertainment is the fact that, you know, when you can go and get a box set of, you know, Jacob Bronowski or, you know, the James Bond films or whatever, what do you watch television for? And I would argue that news is actually one of the stronger brands, because you watch it for live events, and factual television is by and large live event television.
Yeah. Adam, huge thanks.